Okay, John chapter 5. We have an interesting story here of the healing of a lame man that Jesus carries out in Jerusalem. So we'll read here John chapter 5, verses 1 to 18. After this, there was a feast of the Jews, and Jesus went up to Jerusalem. Now there is in Jerusalem by the sheep gate a pool, in Hebrew called Bethesda, which has 5 porticos. In these lay a multitude of invalids, blind, lame, paralyzed. One man was there who had been ill for 38 years. When Jesus saw him and knew that he had been lying there a long time, he said to him, "Do you want to be healed?" The sick man answered him, "Sir, I have no man to put me into the pool when the water is troubled, and while I am going, another steps down before me." Jesus said to him, "Rise, take up your pallet and walk." And at once the man was healed, and he took up his pallet and walked. Now that day was the Sabbath. So the Jews said to the man who was cured, "It is the Sabbath. It is not lawful for you to carry your pallet." But he answered them, "The man who healed me said to me, 'Take up your pallet and walk.'" They asked him, "Who is the man who said to you, 'Take up your pallet and walk'?" Now the man who had been healed did not know who it was, for Jesus had withdrawn, as there was a crowd in the place. Afterward, Jesus found him in the temple and said to him, "See, you are well. Sin no more, that nothing worse befall you." The man went away and told the Jews that it was Jesus who had healed him. And this was why the Jews persecuted Jesus, because he did this on the Sabbath. But Jesus answered them, "My Father is working still, and I am working." This was why the Jews sought all the more to kill him, because he not only broke the Sabbath, but also called God his own Father, making himself equal with God. Up to this point in the Gospel, the signs that Jesus has performed had resulted in faith or belief. We see that in chapter 2, verse 11. After Jesus had turned the water into wine, we were told there that this, the first of his signs, Jesus did at Cana in Galilee and manifested his glory, and his disciples believed in him. And then in chapter 2, verse 23, when Jesus was in Jerusalem at the Passover, many believed in his name when they saw the signs which he did. And then in chapter 4, verse 53, as we saw last week with the healing of the official's son, the father knew that was the hour when Jesus had said to him, "Your son will live," and he himself believed, and all his household. So that had been the purpose of the signs, that they would produce belief or faith. And that's the purpose of John in writing this gospel, as he tells us at the end in chapter 20, verses 30 and 31, that he is writing or recording the signs that Jesus had done so that people might believe, might have that faith. But here in chapter 5, we see Jesus performing a sign, the healing of this man, which produces not faith, but rather opposition from the Jewish leaders in particular. And so here at the beginning of this chapter, we see the start of the opposition to Jesus, the opposition which would eventually lead to his death. At the end of chapter 4, as we looked at last week, Jesus was in Galilee. That healing of the official son took place there in Galilee, between Cana and Capernaum. The event was set there. But now at the beginning of chapter 5, we see that Jesus has returned to Jerusalem in order to attend one of the feasts of the Jews. Verse 1 tells us, after this there was a feast of the Jews, and Jesus went up to Jerusalem. There's no indication here of how much time passes between the end of chapter 4 and the beginning of chapter 5, and John doesn't seem to be too concerned about being very specific when he records time. Here at the beginning of chapter 5, he simply says after this, so at some point after this. And in chapter 6, verse 1, there he says, after this, Jesus went to the other side of the Sea of Galilee. Chapter 7, verse 1, after this, Jesus went about in Galilee. So John very sort of loosely connects these events. He doesn't not very specific about following some chronological timeline of events here, but he's simply recording these as a series of events without really paying too much attention about the time in which they are being placed. The feast that Jesus attends here is not named. John simply says that there was a feast of the Jews. We know that it was Jesus' practice to go to Jerusalem to attend these feasts, and back in chapter 2 and verse 13, he had gone to Jerusalem for the Passover. Chapter 2, verse 13 says the Passover of the Jews was at hand, and Jesus went up to Jerusalem. Then in chapter 7 and verse 2 and verse 10, we learn that he went to Jerusalem for the Feast of Tabernacles. Verse 2 of chapter 7 says, now the Jews' Feast of Tabernacles was at hand. And verse 10 tells us that Jesus went up to the feast, not publicly, but in private. And then in chapter 10, verses 22 and 23, he's in Jerusalem again for the Feast of the Dedication. It was the Feast of the Dedication at Jerusalem. It was winter, and Jesus was walking in the temple in the portico of Solomon. The Feast of Dedication there is what's also called Hanukkah, and takes place around December time. So that's another feast that Jesus attended. And then another Passover again in chapter 12, the final Passover that Jesus attends in Jerusalem. Chapter 12, verse 1 says, 6 days before the Passover, Jesus came to Bethany, where Lazarus was. And then in verse 12 of chapter 12, the next day, a great crowd who had come to the feast heard that Jesus was coming to Jerusalem. So it was Jesus' custom, his practice, to go to Jerusalem to attend these feasts, but we don't know which one this was here in chapter 5, when John just says it was a feast of the Jews. Verse 2 here sets the scene for this sign that is to take place, the healing of this man. John says that there is in Jerusalem by the sheep gate a pool in Hebrew called Bethesda, which has 5 porticos. This pool is located near to the sheep gate, and there was well, the word gate is actually not in the text itself. It simply says that sheep. But there was a sheep gate that was located in the northeast corner of the city wall around Jerusalem. It's a gate that's referred to in the book of Nehemiah in the rebuilding of the walls and the gates around the city. Nehemiah chapter 3 verse 1 makes reference to this. Then Eliashib the high priest rose up with his brethren the priests, and they built the sheep gate. And then in verse 32 of Nehemiah chapter 3 as well, which between the upper chamber of the corner and the sheep gate, the goldsmiths and the merchants repaired. So we're sort of identifying where certain people were making repairs on the wall around the sheep gate. So that's mentioned there, and it's mentioned again in Nehemiah chapter 12, verse 39. This sheep gate was near to the temple, and it may have been a place where the sheep would have been brought in through this gate and sold for sacrifice in the temple. The Authorized Version does translate this as a sheep market. There's in Jerusalem by the sheep market. John gives the Hebrew name of the pool as Bethesda. He refers to it, its Hebrew name there, and that means House of Olive. That's in the Revised Standard Version and the New Revised Standard Version. Some of the other versions which you may be using, the Authorized Version, the New International Version, the English Standard Version, have a different name for it, Bethesda, which means House of Mercy. It's a textual issue there. It's not clear exactly which would be the correct name, but this is where this incident is to take place at this place. In 1888, archaeologists discovered or excavated a site which is believed to be this pool of Bethesda or Bethesda. And the slide there shows a reconstruction of what those pools might have been like. They found the remains of two pools. One was 55 feet long and the second was 65 feet long. And the shorter pool did have these porticos, five porticos or porches, and that would fit in with John's description of the pool here, having these five porticos. So the archaeological evidence, perhaps to locate this pool. In the five porches there, we're told there were a multitude of invalids, blind, lame, paralyzed. So the pool was a place where many sick people would gather with the expectation of being healed. And the authorized version provides an explanation as to why these sick people have gathered at this pool. That's at the end of verse 3 and verse 4, which says that they're there waiting for the moving of the water. For an angel went down at a certain season into the pool and troubled the water. Whoever then first, after the troubling of the water, stepped in was made whole of whatsoever disease he had. If you're reading from one of the more recent versions, the Revised Standard Version or the New International Version, you won't find those verses there in the text. That you may find them as a footnote. They leave this out because the manuscript evidence, which has become available since 1611 and the authorized version, suggests that those words are not part of the original text, that they may have been added later. But the words do give us a likely explanation for the presence of these sick people at the pool. And that's also implied from verse 7, where the man, in answering Jesus, speaks of the water being troubled, that he has no one to put him into the pool when the water is troubled. So that may suggest that there was this superstitious belief that this water had some healing properties after an angel had stirred up the water, disturbed the water, and then the belief was whoever got into the water first would be the one who would be healed. That seemed to be a superstitious belief that they had while they were all gathered around that pool, waiting for that disturbance in the water to occur. John now focuses upon one man in particular of all of those people who were present at the pool. Is just focusing upon one, and Jesus is just focusing on one. And this is a man who has been ill for 38 years. We're not told specifically what his illness is, just that he has been ill for 38 years, although what we do learn is that he seems to be unable to walk and has some mobility issues. So we describe him as being a lame man. But Jesus saw this man, and Jesus knew how long he had been ill. The fact that Jesus knew how long he had been ill need not necessarily mean he was using his supernatural knowledge. But he could have been informed. Others around there could have told Jesus how long the man had been ill for, 38 years, so a long time. And Jesus then asks him the question, do you want to be healed? And we might wonder, well, why would Jesus ask such a question? The answer seems obvious, that surely this man, having been sick for 38 years, surely he would want to be healed. But the man may have been content to stay as he was. To be healed would lead to great changes in his life. He would then have to start taking responsibility for himself. He would have to go and find a job. And so it may have been easier for him just to stay sick and to stay hanging around the pool there. So Jesus perhaps is asking the question in order to test the man's desire for change. Does he really want to be healed? Is he prepared to accept the consequences that would come if he were healed? Is Jesus challenging some complacency or some apathy that may have set in this man's attitude? The man does not answer the question directly, but rather he tries to explain why he hasn't been healed. And perhaps there's an implication there that he does want to be healed. So he tells Jesus that there is no one to help him into the water when the water is disturbed, and someone always gets into the water before him. So this is the irony of the situation, really, that this pool is supposed to be there for healing people, but it's only the strong, those who are strong enough to get into the water, are the ones who may be healed. And the weak ones, like this man, well, they can't get into the water, so they would miss out. So the man's words really suggest, well, it's not that he doesn't want to be healed, it's just that he's had no one to help him get into the water, so he would have that opportunity. He doesn't know who Jesus is, so he's not expecting Jesus to heal him. Perhaps the most he could expect would be for Jesus to stay around long enough to help him into the water when that water is disturbed. Well, at this point, Jesus simply commanded the man to rise, take up your pallet and walk. And immediately the man was healed. And he must have sensed this, sensed that something had happened, for he did as Jesus had told him. He obeyed. He got up, he picked up the pallet or the mattress, whatever it was, looking like that he was been lying on, and he walked. So these muscles in his leg are immediately strong, and he's capable of standing now and walking for himself. And the striking thing about this incident is its suddenness. It happens immediately. As soon as Jesus says the words to him, rise, take up your pallet and walk, and the man gets up. There's no mention here of faith on the part of the lame man. Faith doesn't seem to be a requirement for the healing to take place. He had no expectation that Jesus would heal him. He didn't know who Jesus was. And so it's quite different to the healing of the official's son, as we saw last week at the end of chapter 4, where that man did have faith, and he knew of Jesus. He went to look for Jesus, and he was asking Jesus to come and heal his son. So there was faith was present on that occasion. But here we have Jesus healing in the absence of faith. The last statement of verse 9, though, tells us that all of this happened on the Sabbath day. And this fact then prepares us for what is to happen next in the story. The man, as he's making his way away from the pool, carrying his pallet, his mattress, was challenged by the Jews. And we have to remember that when John speaks of the Jews, he's not talking about all of the Jewish people in general, but he's talking of a specific group, and in particular, the religious leaders. And they say to him, it is the Sabbath. It is not lawful for you to carry your pallet or your mat. Carrying the pallet was regarded as work, and it was something that was forbidden on the Sabbath. The law given by Moses in Exodus chapter 20, verses 8 to 11, had said, remember the Sabbath day to keep it holy. 6 days you shall labor and do all your work, but the seventh day is a Sabbath to the Lord your God. In it you shall not do any work. You or your son or your daughter, your manservant or your maidservant, or your cattle, or the sojourner who is within your gates. For in 6 days the Lord made heaven and earth, the sea and all that is in them, and rested the seventh day. Therefore the Lord blessed the Sabbath day and hallowed it. So no work was allowed to be done on the Sabbath day. But how do you define work? What is work? In an attempt to define work, so they would know what they could do and what they couldn't do on the Sabbath, the scribes and the teachers of the law had developed an elaborate list of activities, 39 activities, that they said were prohibited on the Sabbath, which they defined as being work. And the commentaries give us some examples to demonstrate the absurdity of some of these regulations. So on the Sabbath, a man could borrow a jar from his friend, but not if he said, lend this to me, because to ask would imply that a transaction was taking place, and a transaction might involve writing, and writing was forbidden on the Sabbath. So someone could lend you their jar, but you couldn't ask them, lend this to me, because you were entering into some kind of agreement or contract with them. And then a man could put out his lamp on the Sabbath in order to help a sick person go to sleep or for protection, but he could not put out his lamp in order to save the oil or the wick. The act of putting out the lamp was regarded as work. And then a man could not put vinegar on his tooth in order to relieve a toothache, but he could put vinegar on his food. So you can put it on your fish and chips, but you can't put it on your aching tooth. And then a bed could not be carried, as this man was doing, but it could be carried if a sick person were lying on it. So if this man was still lying on his bed and someone was carrying it, that would be okay. But because he's carrying his own bed, then that's regarded as being work. So the Jews, and they're probably Pharisees, they were very much into keeping these sorts of regulations. They reminded the man that it was the Sabbath day, and therefore he was breaking the Sabbath because he's carrying his bed. The bed was considered to be a burden, and it was not allowed, you're not allowed to carry a burden on the Sabbath. And they could appeal to some passages of scripture to support what they're saying. Jeremiah chapter 17, verses 21 and 22. Jeremiah chapter 17, verse 21 and 22 says, "Thus says the Lord, take heed for the sake of your lives, and do not bear a burden on the Sabbath day, or bring it in by the gates of Jerusalem, and do not carry a burden out of your houses on the Sabbath, or do any work, but keep the Sabbath day holy, as I commanded your fathers." A reminder there of that law in Jeremiah. And then also in Nehemiah, in chapter 13, Nehemiah chapter 13, verse 15, Nehemiah says, "In those days I saw in Judah men treading wine presses on the Sabbath, and bringing in heaps of grain and loading them on asses, and also wine, grapes, figs, and all kinds of burdens, which they brought into Jerusalem on the Sabbath day. And I warned them on the day when they sold food." And verse 19 says also, "When it began to be dark at the gates of Jerusalem before the Sabbath, I commanded that the doors should be shut, and gave orders that they should not be opened until after the Sabbath. And I set some of my servants over the gates, that no burden might be brought in on the Sabbath day." So carrying a burden was not allowed. But those references in Jeremiah and Nehemiah are people are carrying burdens in the course of their normal work, in the selling of food. So that's part of the problem there, is that they are selling food. They're buying and selling food, and they're carrying their goods in on the Sabbath day in order to sell them. That's what's going on there. It's not simply someone who's carrying a bed. So the man's response to this, to the Jews telling him it's not lawful for you to carry your pallet, is that he, in a way, tries to shift the responsibility for his action onto Jesus. He says, "The man who healed me said to me, 'Take up your pallet and walk.'" If someone has the power to heal a man who has been ill for 38 years, then the man is not going to argue when the man tells him to take up his pallet and walk. So we see this lame man is willing to break the Sabbath in order to have the benefit of that healing. So in a way, he's perhaps standing up for Jesus here, that he's recognizing the authority of the one who told him, recognizing, well, this man must have greater authority than you Jewish leaders, because he was the one who healed me. He was the one who told me to do this, to break the Sabbath. Well, the Jewish leaders now want to know who this man is, who's been going around telling people to carry their pallets, their beds on the Sabbath. And they're not interested in the fact that this man has just been healed. They feel no sense of joy or happiness for the man that he can now walk. They don't even mention that. They are more concerned that someone is going around encouraging people to break the Sabbath regulations. But the man was unable to tell them who it was who had healed him. He didn't know who Jesus was, and he couldn't point Jesus out to them because Jesus by now had quietly withdrawn from the scene. He'd gone away, slipped away into the crowd. So he doesn't know who this is. But sometime later, and again, we're not told here how long after the incident, Jesus found the man in the temple. We may wonder, did Jesus deliberately go and look for him? But it's interesting that the man has gone to the temple. As a lame man, he would not have been allowed in the temple before this, but now he can go into the temple. So may he be, he's gone there to give thanks to God for his healing. But Jesus found him there in the temple, and Jesus draws attention to the fact that he has been healed. See, you are well. This healing had been permanent. And then Jesus said to him, sin no more, that nothing worse befall you. Again, why did Jesus say that to him? Jesus' words may imply that the man's physical condition, his sickness, had been caused by some sin he had committed in the past. And sometimes sin does produce physical consequences, not necessarily as a punishment, but there are consequences for certain sinful actions that someone might commit. So is Jesus making a connection there between his past sin and his physical condition? Or Jesus may not be suggesting that at all, that there's any direct connection between some particular sin of his past and his sickness, but rather pointing out to him the need for him now to give attention to his spiritual condition as well. His physical body has been healed, and now he needs to think about his spiritual condition too. He needs to do something about his sin. So Jesus is not just concerned about the man's physical condition, he is also concerned about his spiritual well-being as well. Jesus is concerned about the whole person. Later in chapter 7, verse 23, Jesus makes reference to this incident again, when he's in another dispute with the Jews over the Sabbath. He says, if on the Sabbath the man receives circumcision, so that the law of Moses may not be broken, are you angry with me because on the Sabbath I made a man's whole body well? Jesus speaks there of making a man's whole body well. And Jesus was concerned about the whole person, the whole of their well-being, spiritual and physical. Again, a similar thing may come to mind with the paralyzed man who was let down through the roof in Mark chapter 2, verses 4 and 5. Again, where Jesus deals with the man's sin before he heals him. In Mark chapter 2, verse 4 and 5, we have this paralyzed man, who's carried by his four friends to see Jesus. Jesus is in the house. There's a big crowd around the house and they can't get in. And when they could not get near him because of the crowd, they removed the roof above him. And when they had made an opening, they let down the pallet on which the paralytic lay. And when Jesus saw their faith, he said to the paralytic, my son, your sins are forgiven. In that case, Jesus dealt with his sins before he then went on to heal the man. So Jesus is always concerned about both the spiritual aspect of a person's well-being as well as their physical aspect. The sin may be also possibly unbelief. Unbelief is seen as the major sin in John's gospel, that it's unbelief that prevents things from happening. In John chapter 8, verse 24, here, Jesus, again speaking with the people, says, I told you that you would die in your sins, for you will die in your sins unless you believe that I am he. So unbelief is, if this layman doesn't believe who Jesus is, then something worse perhaps could happen to him. So Jesus is encouraging this man then, in one way or another, to turn from his sin. Don't continue in a state of sin. He says, so that nothing worse befall you. So a condition worse than 38 years of sickness would perhaps be the eternal consequences if he remained in a state of unbelief. Well, after this meeting with Jesus, Jesus found the man in the temple and had this conversation with him. After this, the man then returned to the Jews in order to inform them that it was Jesus who had healed him. Earlier, he'd said he didn't know who the man was, but now he does. Again, why did he do this? Why go back to them and tell them that it was Jesus? He may have done it in order to gain the favor of the Jewish leaders. He'd been accused of breaking the Sabbath, but now if he can produce the name of the person who told him to break the Sabbath, then perhaps he will get himself out of trouble. He may have done it out of a sense of duty, of the need to obey those who are in a position of authority. But whatever the reason for his action, the incident demonstrates perhaps the amount of control that the Jewish leaders had over the people and the intimidation that they were able to exercise over people. The results, though, of all of this for Jesus was now that he was now persecuted because he had broken the Sabbath regulations by healing on the Sabbath. The man had broken the Sabbath regulations by carrying his bed. Jesus had broken the Sabbath regulations by carrying out this healing. And so from now on, Jesus would face the hostile actions of the Jews, the Jewish leaders here. Verse 16 here says, this is why the Jews persecuted Jesus, because he did this on the Sabbath. Jesus responded to this charge of Sabbath breaking by saying, my Father is working still, and I am working. This is Jesus' defense. He's defending his action by identifying himself with the Father, claiming God as his Father. The Father, he says, does not stop working on the Sabbath. If God stopped his activity, then the world would cease to exist, as God is sustaining this world. And Jesus works in the same way. He doesn't stop working on the Sabbath either. And so what he's indicating here is that there's an equality between the work that Jesus is doing and the work that the Father is doing, that they are one and the same. So if God the Father works on the Sabbath, then it is appropriate that his Son should also work, because he is doing the work of God. And the Jews understood exactly what Jesus was saying here, what he's claiming, and they're determined to kill him for it. Verse 18 here says, this was why the Jews sought all the more to kill him, because he not only broke the Sabbath, but also called God his own Father, making himself equal with God. So it's not just about breaking the Sabbath now, it's about the claim that Jesus is making as well. He's making himself equal with God, they were saying. So he claimed something here that no Jew would ever dare to claim, claiming a special relationship with the Father, an equality with the Father, claim to possess the same nature as the Father. Chapter 10, verse 33 is, we see this again here. In chapter 10, verse 33, this is when they take up stones in order to stone Jesus, and Jesus answers them, I've shown you many good works from the Father, for which of these do you stone me? The Jews answered him, it is not for a good work that we stone you, but for blasphemy, because you, being a man, make yourself God. So this was blasphemy, as they understood it, what Jesus was claiming. And so from this incident, then we see the beginning of the opposition to Jesus. And really what lies at the heart of this opposition is the identity of Jesus. Who is Jesus? And this is what will eventually lead Jesus to the cross and to his crucifixion. But it all begins here in John's Gospel anyway, in chapter 5, and this incident with the healing of this lame man. So a few things to reflect upon here from this evening. How would you assess the character and the actions of the man Jesus healed? What do you make of him? Why did Jesus heal in the absence of faith? The man didn't seem to show any faith. Jesus still healed him. And then what lay at the heart of the opposition to Jesus? Then if you want to do a little bit more, note the differences and the similarities between the healing of the lame man here in John chapter 5 and the healing of the man who was born blind in John chapter 9. And there's two stories there, and there's some interesting similarities and differences between the two stories there, if you want to have a look at that as well. And then for next time, we'll continue on here in chapter 5, look at the rest of the chapter, which is a continuation really of Jesus' defense, which he started there in verses 17 and 18, and goes on verse 19 down to verse 47 there as well. So we'll be having a look at that next week, but we will stop here